Did you know that in Peru, people eat over 60 different varieties of potatoes? And that's barely scratching the surface. In fact, the potato was first domesticated in Peru thousands of years ago. So the next time you're munching on French fries or chips, you can thank Peru for your carb addiction. But Peru is not just about potatoes, llamas, or Machu Picchu postcards. This country is a layered story of civilizations, extremes of geography, and a people who've endured everything from empires to colonial conquest to modern challenges, and still kept their unique identity alive. So let's take a quick tour of Peru's story before we dive deeper. First, the culture and people. Peruvians are a mix of indigenous, Spanish, African and Asian heritage, which has created one of the most diverse cultures in Latin America. Festivals here aren't rare events, they're practically a weekly occurrence, whether it's Catholic processions in Lima or indigenous celebrations high in the Andes. Food is another national obsession. Peru's cuisine is often ranked among the best in the world. Think ceviche, roasted guinea pig, alpaca steaks, and more varieties of corn than you can imagine. But Peru also faces challenges. Poverty in rural areas, stark divisions between city life and mountain villages, and ongoing struggles with inequality. It's a country of vibrancy and resilience, but also one where tradition and modernity often collide. Now, the nature. Peru is one of the most geographically diverse countries on Earth. In the west, you've got the dry coastal desert. In the middle, the Andes Mountains cut across the land like a jagged spine. And in the east, a vast portion of the Amazon rainforest stretches out into mystery. This means Peru has climates ranging from freezing peaks to steamy jungles to arid plains. It's home to condors with wingspans wider than a car, pink dolphins that swim in the rivers, and rainforests so dense that new species are still being discovered every year. But living in such an extreme environment comes with natural challenges too. Earthquakes, floods, and landslides have been part of Peruvian life for centuries. Next, the history. Peru was once home to some of the greatest civilizations in the Americas. Long before the Incas built Machu Picchu, there were the Moche, the Nazca, the Wari, and the Chavin. Each left behind incredible architecture, art, and knowledge. The Inca Empire eventually rose as the largest in the Americas before the Spanish arrived in the 1500s. With conquest came disease, forced labor, and the plundering of gold and silver. But it also brought new traditions, languages, and religions that blended into the Peru we see today. The centuries that followed were full of struggle, from colonial rule to independence in the 1800s to political instability in the 20th century. Peru's history is not a straight line, but a turbulent, fascinating mix of triumph and hardship. And finally, the present day. Modern Peru is a nation balancing ancient traditions with rapid change. Lima, the capital, is a bustling megacity on the Pacific, home to world-class restaurants and a booming middle class. But travel inland and you'll find villages where Quechua and Aymara languages are still spoken, and farming looks much the same as it did centuries ago. Politically, Peru has faced turbulence. Presidents come and go with surprising speed, corruption scandals make headlines, and social protests are not uncommon. Yet despite it all, Peruvians remain deeply proud of their heritage. Globally, Peru is known for tourism, mining, agriculture, and of course its culinary scene. Its future is still being written, but one thing is clear: Peru is a country that refuses to be defined by just one story. So that's Peru in a nutshell. Potatoes, mountains, empires and chaos, but also a country with beauty, resilience and a culture that has outlasted centuries of change. Now let's slow things down and begin the deeper journey. If you ask a Peruvian what makes their country unique, they'll probably answer with one of three things: food, history, or football. And honestly, all three are pretty valid. But let's start with something that might surprise you: In Peru, it's not unusual to serve roasted guinea pig, known locally as cuy, at a family gathering. For many outsiders, the idea of eating what's considered a beloved household pet elsewhere might feel shocking, but in the Andes, cuy has been part of the cuisine for thousands of years. It's a dish for special occasions, usually served whole, head and all, which can be a little intimidating for first-time visitors. But for Peruvians, it's just another part of a rich culinary tradition that blends ancient indigenous practices with Spanish, African, Chinese, and Japanese influences. That's the thing about Peru. It's not just one culture, it's many cultures layered together like the terraces carved into the Andes Mountains. And depending on where you are, in the highland villages, the sprawling coastal cities, or deep in the Amazon, looks very different. Most of Peru's people live along the coast, especially in and around Lima, which holds about a third of the country's entire population. Lima is the beating heart of modern Peru, loud, crowded, and endlessly busy. It's also where most of the country's economic and cultural opportunities are concentrated. Here you'll find the best restaurants, universities, and industries. But Lima can also be a place of contrasts. Wealthy neighbourhoods with gleaming apartment towers sit next to sprawling informal settlements where many people live without reliable water or electricity. For Peruvians who migrate from rural areas to the capital, Lima can feel like both a land of opportunity and a city of hardship. Then there are the Andes. Life in the mountains is much more traditional, with small towns and villages scattered along the steep valleys and plateaus. Many people here still speak Quechua or Aymara, languages that go back to the Inca and pre-Inca times. Farming is central to daily life, with potatoes, corn and quinoa making up the backbone of the local diet. Festivals are common, often blending Catholic traditions introduced by the Spanish with indigenous rituals that go back centuries. In towns like Cusco or Puno, you might witness processions with saints carried on the shoulders of locals, while dancers in colourful costumes whirl around performing moves that were once part of pre-Columbian ceremonies. The Andes are also where community ties run strong. Families tend to be large, and neighbours often depend on each other for help during harvests or festivals. Life is slower than in Lima, but it can also be harder, especially in areas where poverty is widespread, infrastructure is lacking, and young people leave in search of better opportunities. Further east lies the Amazon. About 13% of Peru's population lives in the rainforest in cities like Iquitos or Pucallpa, or in smaller communities scattered along the rivers. The Amazon is one of Peru's most diverse cultural regions, home to dozens of indigenous groups, many with their own languages, traditions, and ways of life. For example, the Shipibo-Canibo people are known for their vibrant art, textiles, and spiritual traditions, which often involve the ceremonial use of plants like ayahuasca. Life in the Amazon can feel completely different from the rest of Peru. The food, the climate, the social rhythms. Fish replaces potatoes as a staple, canoes replace cars, and the rainforest itself shapes nearly every part of daily living. But the Amazon is also under constant pressure from deforestation, mining, and oil extraction, which threatens both the environment and the people who call it home. Religion is another defining part of Peruvian culture. Officially, Peru is a Catholic country, and more than 75% of Peruvians identify with the Catholic Church. But in practice, religion here is a unique fusion. For instance, the Virgen de la Candelaria festival in Puno combines Catholic imagery with indigenous dance and music, creating a celebration that feels distinctly Peruvian rather than strictly European. You'll also find people who still honour ancient deities alongside their Christian faith, making offerings to Pachamama or Mother Earth before planting crops or starting a journey. It's a blending of worlds, old and new, indigenous and colonial, sacred and secular. And then there's the food, which deserves its own spotlight. Peruvian cuisine is often described as one of the best in the world, and it's not an exaggeration. Lima has repeatedly been named the culinary capital of South America, with chefs who are celebrated internationally. The diversity of Peru's landscapes is reflected in its food. Seafood dishes like ceviche dominate the coast. Hearty stews and roasted meats fill the tables in the Andes, and exotic fruits and river fish are staples in the Amazon. Chinese immigrants brought stir-frying, which evolved into the beloved dish lomo saltado, a mix of beef, peppers, onions and soy sauce, served with rice and fries. Japanese immigrants introduced techniques that shaped Peruvian sushi and Nikkei cuisine. And of course, Peru gave the world potatoes, corn and quinoa, staples that now appear on dinner tables around the globe. For many Peruvians, food isn't just sustenance. It's pride, identity, and a way of telling the story of their country. But Peru's cultural richness also comes with challenges. Inequality is a recurring theme, especially between urban and rural populations. Indigenous communities often face discrimination, underrepresentation in politics, and limited access to education and healthcare. Spanish is the dominant language, but millions of Peruvians still speak Quechua or Aymara, and preserving these languages is a constant struggle. Urban migration has created tensions as people from the countryside move into cities looking for work, sometimes finding opportunity, but often encountering prejudice and tough living conditions. Festivals help to bring people together despite these divides. Peru has thousands of local celebrations, each with its own flavour. Some are solemn, like Holy Week in Ayacucho, where the entire city is decorated with floral carpets and candlelit processions. Others are wild, like the Inti Raymi festival in Cusco, a revival of an Inca sun ceremony that now draws tourists from around the world. And then there's the Fiesta de la Marinera, dedicated to Peru's national dance, where couples twirl and flirt with handkerchiefs in an elegant display of romance and grace. These celebrations aren't just for show, they're part of the glue that holds Peruvian society together, reinforcing local identity and community bonds. Family life in Peru is another cornerstone of the culture. Families are often large and multi-generational, with grandparents, parents and children sharing the same household. Respect for elders is deeply ingrained, and family gatherings are frequent, often centered around meals. In rural areas, families work together on farms, while in urban areas, they may pool resources to support children's education or start small businesses. But family structures are also adapting. In cities, nuclear families are becoming more common, and migration means many young people live far from their parents or extended relatives. Sports, especially football, are another cultural obsession. The Peruvian national team has had its ups and downs, but when they qualify for a World Cup, the entire country unites in celebration. Streets fill with fans in red and white jerseys, and for a moment all the divisions of class, language and geography seem to melt away. Football clubs like Alianza Lima or Universitario inspire fierce loyalty, and matches between them can feel almost like religious events. To really understand the people of Peru, you have to embrace the contradictions. It's a country where modern skyscrapers overlook pre-Columbian ruins, where indigenous traditions coexist with Catholic processions, where poverty exists alongside some of the most innovative cuisine in the world. The people are warm, resilient, and often deeply tied to their land and traditions. But they're also grappling with the challenges of globalization, inequality, and political instability. At its core, Peruvian culture is about adaptation. From the ancient farmers who learned to carve terraces into impossible mountainsides, to the modern chefs who blend Japanese techniques with Amazonian ingredients, Peruvians have always found ways to take what the world throws at them and turn it into something new. It's not always easy and it's not always fair, but it's what has kept the culture alive for centuries. So when you think about Peru, don't just picture Machu Picchu, llamas or even potatoes. Picture a family in the Andes gathering for a festival that blends Catholic saints with Inca gods. Picture a bustling Lima street where street vendors sell ceviche next to teenagers scrolling TikTok. Picture an Amazon village where traditions passed down for generations are still alive, even as the outside world pushes closer every year. That's Peru, a culture that's not just rich but alive, constantly evolving and deeply human. If Peru were a painting, it would be three giant brushstrokes: the desert coast, the towering Andes, and the endless Amazon. Each one is so distinct that traveling from one to the other feels like crossing entire continents. And this dramatic geography isn't just stunning to look at, it's the backbone of Peru's culture, history, and economy. Let's start with the coast. Peru has more than 1,500 miles of Pacific shoreline, but don't expect endless tropical beaches like you might see in the Caribbean. Much of the coast is desert, a dry, almost Martian landscape where rainfall is so rare that some weather stations go years without recording a single drop. The Atacama Desert stretches into southern Peru, creating some of the driest places on Earth. But even here, people have made the land work for them. Ancient civilizations like the Nazca carved massive geoglyphs into the desert floor, mysterious lines and shapes so big they can only be fully seen from the sky. The coast is also where most of Peru's major cities are, including Lima. While the desert might seem inhospitable, the Humboldt Current that flows offshore creates some of the richest fisheries in the world, making anchovies and other species a major export. It also cools the air, blanketing cities like Lima in a grey mist called garua for much of the year. Further inland, the landscape rises suddenly and dramatically into the Andes, which cut right through the heart of Peru like a massive spine. The mountains are both breathtaking and unforgiving. Some peaks tower over 20,000 feet, capped with glaciers that feed rivers and valleys below. For thousands of years, the Andes have forced Peruvians to adapt to extreme conditions. Farmers developed terrace farming to grow crops on steep slopes, and they learned to cultivate hardy plants like potatoes and quinoa that can survive at high altitudes. Today, traveling through the Andes means winding roads that snake through valleys and villages, with llamas and alpacas grazing on the hillsides. One of the most famous parts of the Andes is the Sacred Valley near Cusco, once the heart of the Inca Empire. Here, the mountains open into fertile plains dotted with ruins, traditional towns and markets. And of course there's Machu Picchu, perched on a ridge high above the Urubamba River. Even after centuries, the site looks almost impossibly placed, a reminder of how the Incas mastered their environment in ways that still amaze scientists and engineers. But the Andes aren't just about ancient history. They're alive today with communities that still farm, herd, and celebrate festivals just as their ancestors did, blending old traditions with modern life. But as you travel further east, the Andes give way to an entirely different world: the Amazon. Nearly 60% of Peru is covered by rainforest, making it one of the most biodiverse countries on Earth. The Amazon basin here is a maze of rivers, swamps, and dense forest, home to countless species of plants and animals. Peru's Amazon is one of the most pristine in South America, with massive national parks and reserves that protect everything from jaguars and pink river dolphins to giant trees and medicinal plants. Cities like Iquitos, which can only be reached by boat or plane, serve as gateways into this vast wilderness. For visitors, the Amazon can feel overwhelming, like stepping into a different planet where the air is thick with humidity, the trees seem impossibly tall, and the sounds of birds, insects, and monkeys echo constantly. What makes Peru's geography so fascinating is the contrast. You can wake up in a foggy coastal desert, drive into snow-capped mountains by lunchtime, and fall asleep in the humid jungle by night. This diversity doesn't just create beautiful scenery, It shapes everything from the country's economy to its culture. Coastal cities focus on trade and fishing. Highland towns rely on agriculture and tourism. Amazonian communities depend on the forest and rivers for survival. These regions often feel like different worlds, and connecting them has always been one of Peru's biggest challenges. Peru is also a country of extremes when it comes to nature. Take Lake Titicaca, for example. Straddling the border with Bolivia, it's the highest navigable lake in the world at over 12,000 feet above sea level. The lake is dotted with islands, some natural and some man-made, like the floating islands of the Uros people built entirely from layers of reeds. Or consider Colca Canyon, one of the deepest canyons on Earth, nearly twice as deep as the Grand Canyon. Visitors come not only for the staggering views, but also for the chance to see Andean condors soaring on the rising air currents. And then there's the wildlife. Peru is one of the world's mega-diverse countries, with species found nowhere else. In the Amazon, you'll find sloths, tapirs, anacondas, and vibrant macaws. The Andes are home to vicuñas, the wild cousins of llamas, prized for their ultra-soft wool. On the coast, you can spot sea lions basking on rocky islands and penguins waddling along the Paracas Peninsula. Peru's natural diversity has made it a paradise for scientists, conservationists, and eco-tourists alike. But nature here is not always gentle. Peru sits on the Pacific Ring of Fire, which means earthquakes are a regular occurrence. Some have been devastating, destroying towns and cities. Volcanic activity is also part of the landscape, especially in southern regions like Arequipa, which lies in the shadow of several volcanoes. The climate can also be unpredictable, especially with the El Niño phenomenon, which brings heavy rains and flooding to some regions while causing droughts in others. These natural challenges have forced Peruvians to constantly adapt, just as their ancestors did. Water, in particular, is a crucial issue. The glaciers of the Andes provide much of Peru's fresh water, but many of those glaciers are shrinking due to climate change. For rural communities, this threatens farming and daily life. For cities, it raises concerns about long-term sustainability. At the same time, the Amazon faces threats from deforestation, mining, and oil extraction. While large parts of the rainforest are protected, illegal logging and agriculture still chip away at the ecosystem. Despite these challenges, Peru's natural beauty continues to be one of its greatest assets. Tourism is a major industry, with millions of visitors each year drawn by its landscapes. Hiking the Inca Trail, exploring the Amazon, or sandboarding in the coastal desert are just a few of the experiences that put Peru on the map. And for Peruvians themselves, the land is more than just scenery, it's part of their identity. The mountains, rivers, and forests are tied to spiritual beliefs, cultural traditions, and everyday survival. What makes Peru stand out is that it contains so much of the planet's variety within its borders. Few countries can claim to have both glaciers and tropical rainforests, deserts and fertile valleys, canyons deeper than the Grand Canyon, and lakes that touch the sky. This diversity explains why Peru has been such a cradle of civilizations, why it produces such an incredible range of crops, and why its culture is so deeply tied to the land. So, when you think of Peru's geography, don't just think of Machu Picchu or the Amazon. Think of a land where the desert meets the ocean, where mountains rise like walls into the sky, and where rivers weave through the largest rainforest on Earth. It's not just beautiful, it's a reminder of how diverse, dramatic, and sometimes fragile our planet can be. When most people think of Peru's history, one word immediately jumps to mind: Incas. And it makes sense. The Inca Empire was the largest and most powerful state in pre-Columbian America, stretching thousands of miles and leaving behind wonders like Machu Picchu. But here's the twist. The Incas are actually latecomers to Peru's story. By the time they rose to power in the 1400s, Civilizations had already been thriving in Peru for thousands of years, building pyramids, creating massive artworks in the desert, and developing some of the earliest urban societies in the Americas. To really understand Peru, you have to rewind far before the Incas took the stage. The earliest evidence of human presence in Peru goes back around 12,000 years to hunter-gatherer groups who roamed the coast, mountains and jungles. Archaeologists have found stone tools, cave paintings and even the remains of seafood-heavy diets, showing that early Peruvians were quick to exploit the country's rich environments. But by around 3000 BCE, things started to change dramatically. People began forming permanent settlements and experimenting with agriculture, especially along the coast, where rivers flowing from the Andes created fertile oases in the desert. One of the oldest known sites is Caral in the Supa Valley. Dating back to around 2600 BCE, Caral is considered the oldest city in the Americas. Imagine pyramids, plazas and residential areas, all built at roughly the same time the Egyptians were constructing their own pyramids. What's even more remarkable is that Caral shows no evidence of warfare. Instead, it seems society was organized around trade, religion and music. Archaeologists even found flutes made from pelican bones. As centuries passed, new cultures emerged across Peru's varied landscapes. Along the northern coast, the Moche civilization, 100 to 700 CE, became famous for its incredible pottery and monumental temples. The Moche were master storytellers in clay, creating highly detailed ceramics that depicted everything from daily life to mythology to scenes of battle and even some rather graphic sexual imagery. Their architecture was equally impressive, with massive adobe pyramids like the Huaca del Sol and Huaca de la Luna. But the Moche also had a darker side. Evidence suggests they practiced human sacrifice, often killing captured warriors in elaborate rituals meant to appease their gods. Floods and droughts eventually weakened the Moche, but their influence lingered for centuries. Further south, another group left behind one of Peru's most enduring mysteries, the Nazca. Between 200 BCE and 600 CE, they created the Nazca lines, enormous geoglyphs etched into the desert floor. From the ground, they looked like random lines and shapes, but from above, they formed giant animals, plants, and geometric patterns. To this day, nobody knows for certain why they made them. Were they offerings to the gods? Astronomical markers? Messages to the heavens? Whatever the answer, the Nazca lines remind us that ancient Peruvians weren't just skilled builders. They were imaginative artists with ideas far ahead of their time. In the highlands, the city of Tiwanaku, located near Lake Titicaca, became a major center around 500 CE. Though technically in modern-day Bolivia, its influence extended deep into southern Peru. Tiwanaku was a hub of trade, religion and innovation, building monumental stone structures that still puzzle engineers. Around the same period, the Wari civilization rose to power in the central Andes. The Wari were early empire builders, creating a network of roads, administrative centers and planned cities that foreshadowed what the Incas would later accomplish on an even greater scale. By the time the Incas arrived on the scene in the 1200s, Peru was already a patchwork of sophisticated cultures with their own traditions, technologies and rivalries. The Incas didn't start from scratch. They borrowed and expanded upon ideas from those who came before them. They inherited terrace farming, irrigation systems and road building techniques. They adapted religious concepts and administrative models. And then, in just a few generations, they turned all of this into something astonishing. The Inca Empire, known as Tawantinsuyu, meaning Land of the Four Quarters, was officially founded in the early 1400s. Centered in Cusco, the Incas rapidly expanded through conquest, diplomacy and smart alliances, eventually ruling over an empire that stretched from modern-day Colombia in the north to Chile and Argentina in the south. At its height, Tawantinsuyu controlled about 10 million people, making it one of the largest empires in the world at the time. What made the Incas so successful was their ability to organize and integrate such a diverse territory. They built an enormous road system covering more than 25,000 miles, connecting mountains, valleys, and deserts. Messengers called chasquis would run these routes, passing messages like a relay team to deliver news across the empire with astonishing speed. They also used a system of knotted strings called quipus to keep track of records, from population counts to tribute payments. While we still haven't fully deciphered how quipus worked, they show that the Incas had a highly sophisticated way of managing information without a written language. Agriculture was the lifeblood of the Inca Empire. Using terraces carved into the mountainsides, they grew potatoes, maize, quinoa, and coca, carefully adapting crops to different altitudes and climates. Storage facilities called quilcas ensured food could be distributed across the empire, helping communities survive droughts or poor harvests. This centralized system of production and redistribution gave the Incas a level of stability unmatched in the region. Religion also played a unifying role. The Incas worshipped the sun god Inti as their supreme deity, claiming that the ruling emperor, the Sapa Inca, was his direct descendant. Temples like Coricancha in Cusco were covered in gold to honor Inti, symbolizing the sun's brilliance. But the Incas also incorporated local deities into their pantheon, allowing conquered peoples to keep elements of their spiritual traditions. This strategy helped reduce resistance and made subjects feel included, even as they were absorbed into the empire. Of course, not everyone loved being ruled by the Incas. The empire expanded rapidly through conquest, and many local groups resented the heavy tribute and forced labor system known as mita. Rebellions broke out in various regions, but the Incas were usually quick and ruthless in suppressing them. Still, this simmering discontent would later play a major role in the empire's downfall. Despite their power, the Incas only ruled for about a century. By the early 1500s, they were already dealing with internal problems. A civil war broke out between two brothers, Atahualpa and Huascar, both claiming the throne after their father's death. The conflict weakened the empire at the worst possible moment, just as Spanish conquistadors were arriving on the coast. When Francisco Pizarro marched into Peru in the 1530s, he found an empire divided, exhausted, and vulnerable. The story of how a few hundred Spaniards toppled millions of Incas is one of history's most dramatic and tragic encounters. But that's a tale for the next chapter. For now, what's important to remember is that Peru's ancient history isn't just the story of the Incas. It's a long, layered narrative of civilizations rising and falling, each leaving its mark on the landscape and culture. From the pyramids of Caral to the pottery of the Moche, from the Nazca lines to the administrative centers of the Wari, Peru was a laboratory of human innovation long before Europeans ever arrived. The Incas were the culmination of this process, not the beginning, and maybe that's the real hook. Peru wasn't just home to one great civilization, it was home to a whole series of them, each building on the last, creating a legacy that still shapes the country today. When the Spanish first set foot in Peru in the early 1500s, they walked into a perfect storm. The Inca Empire was at its peak in size, but also at its weakest internally. A devastating civil war had just ended, with Atahualpa defeating his brother Huascar to become the new Sapa Inca. But his victory celebrations didn't last long. In 1532, Francisco Pizarro arrived with fewer than 200 men, and through a combination of audacity, timing, and sheer ruthlessness, he captured Atahualpa in the city of Cajamarca. This single act turned the fate of Peru upside down. Atahualpa was a prisoner, but he thought he could buy his freedom. He offered Pizarro a ransom that remains one of the most jaw-dropping deals in history. He promised to fill a room with gold and 2 more with silver. Over the next months, his subjects hauled in unimaginable wealth: golden goblets, silver ornaments, sacred artifacts ripped from temples. But once the ransom was collected, the Spanish executed Atahualpa anyway. His death marked the beginning of the end for the Inca Empire. The conquest wasn't just about guns and steel. The Spaniards cleverly exploited existing rivalries among the Inca's subject peoples. Many communities who had been forced into the empire saw the Spaniards as liberators, at least at first. Native auxiliaries joined Pizarro's forces in large numbers, tipping the balance. Smallpox and other European diseases also tore through the population, killing millions who had never encountered these illnesses before. In a matter of decades, the Inca world unravelled. Cusco, the Inca capital, fell in 1533, and Lima was founded 2 years later on the Pacific coast as the new centre of Spanish rule. This was no accident. The Spaniards wanted a port city that connect Peru's riches to the wider empire. From Lima, silver and gold poured into Spain, fueling Europe's economy but devastating indigenous life. Colonial Peru quickly became one of the jewels of the Spanish Empire, thanks to the mountain of silver at Potosí, technically in modern Bolivia, but part of Peru at the time. The mines were so productive that the phrase "worth a Potosí" became shorthand for immense wealth. But this silver came at an almost unimaginable human cost. Indigenous workers were forced into the meter system, a revival of Inca labour practices, but now twisted into brutal servitude. Men were sent to the mines for months at a time, where mercury poisoning, cave-ins and sheer exhaustion killed countless thousands. The wealth extracted didn't stay in Peru, it sailed across the Atlantic to fill the coffers of the Spanish crown. The colonial period also reshaped Peru's culture and society. Catholic missionaries flooded the country, eager to replace native religions with Christianity. Temples were destroyed or converted into churches, though in many cases local traditions blended with Catholic rituals to create a uniquely Andean form of Christianity. The Spanish brought their language, their architecture, and their institutions, layering them over the existing Inca framework. Cities like Lima became showcases of colonial power, filled with grand plazas, monasteries, and government palaces. But in the countryside, many indigenous communities quietly maintained older traditions, passing down languages like Quechua and Aymara despite centuries of suppression. Peru also became part of the infamous transatlantic trade network. African slaves were brought to work in coastal plantations, textile workshops, and even in some mines. Over time, their presence added another layer to Peru's cultural mix. Today, Afro-Peruvian music and dance remain an important part of the country's identity, a reminder of this painful but formative history. The colonial system was rigidly hierarchical. At the top were the Peninsulares, Spaniards born in Europe. Below them were the Criollos, people of Spanish descent born in the Americas. Beneath them came mestizos of mixed Spanish and indigenous heritage, then indigenous people, and finally African slaves. Social mobility was limited and resentment simmered for centuries, especially among indigenous communities who bore the brunt of exploitation. This resentment occasionally boiled over. One of the most famous uprisings was led by Tupac Amaru II in the 1780s. Claiming descent from the Inca royal line, he called for an end to Spanish abuses and launched a rebellion that spread across the Andes. For a brief moment, it seemed like the Spanish might lose their grip on Peru, but the uprising was brutally suppressed. Tupac Amaru II was captured and executed in a horrific public display, his body torn apart as a warning to others. Yet his legacy endured, becoming a powerful symbol for future independence movements. By the early 1800s, the winds of revolution were sweeping Latin America. Across the continent, colonies were rising against Spain, inspired by Enlightenment ideals, the American Revolution, and the turmoil in Europe caused by Napoleon's invasions. But Peru was different. As the richest colony and the seat of Spanish power in South America, it remained loyal longer than most. The elite in Lima, who benefited from the colonial system, were cautious about breaking ties. Independence came not from within, but from without. In 1820, Argentine General José de San Martín landed on the coast of Peru with his liberation army. He entered Lima in 1821 and declared independence, though Spanish forces still controlled much of the interior. 2 years later, Simón Bolívar, the Venezuelan liberator, arrived to finish the job. After a series of decisive battles, the Spanish were finally defeated at Ayacucho in 1824. Peru was free, at least in name. But independence didn't bring immediate peace or prosperity. The new republic struggled with deep divisions between Lima's elite and the Andean majority, between coastal cities and rural highlands, between different factions competing for power. Political instability, economic struggles, and the legacy of colonial inequality haunted Peru throughout the 19th century. The promises of liberty and equality often rang hollow for indigenous and Afro-Peruvian communities, who found that independence simply replaced one ruling class with another. Still, independence marked a turning point. Peru was no longer a Spanish colony. It was a nation struggling to define itself in a world where old empires were collapsing and new ones were rising. The echoes of conquest, colonialism, and rebellion still reverberate today in Peru's identity, its struggles and its resilience. If ancient Peru was the story of civilizations rising and falling, colonial Peru was the story of survival under domination, and independence was the messy, unfinished beginning of something new. If you land in Peru today, the first thing you'll notice is contrast. Lima, the sprawling capital of over 11 million people, looks like a modern Latin American metropolis with high-rises, traffic jams, and hip cafes where you can grab a flat white. But a short flight or bus ride away, you're in the Andes, where families still farm potatoes the way their ancestors did centuries ago, and villagers speak Quechua rather than Spanish. Peru's present is a balancing act between tradition and modernity, progress and struggle, city and countryside. One of the biggest aspects of modern Peru is its economy. Over the last few decades, Peru has been one of Latin America's fastest growing economies, driven by mining, agriculture and tourism. The country is rich in natural resources. Copper, gold, silver and natural gas are major exports. Mining alone makes up about 10% of GDP and around 60% of exports, making it the lifeblood of the economy. But it's also controversial. Local communities often protest mining projects, arguing that they destroy the environment and provide little benefit to the people who actually live there. These clashes sometimes turn violent, highlighting the tension between economic growth and social justice. Agriculture is another key piece. Peru's coastal valleys are some of the most productive farmland in the world, pumping out asparagus, avocados, grapes and blueberries that end up in supermarkets across the globe. In the highlands, small-scale farmers keep ancient Andean crops alive, like quinoa, potatoes and maize. But farming in the Andes isn't easy. Climate change has started to threaten traditional agriculture, with unpredictable rains, shrinking glaciers, and new pests challenging the resilience of rural communities. Tourism is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it brings in billions of dollars. Machu Picchu alone attracts over 1 million visitors a year, and cities like Cusco, Arequipa, and Lima are major draws. Adventure seekers flock to the Andes for hiking and mountaineering, while others head into the Amazon for jungle expeditions. On the other hand, mass tourism puts enormous pressure on fragile ecosystems and cultural sites. Machu Picchu has had to introduce strict limits on daily visitors to prevent damage. For locals, tourism can mean jobs and opportunity, but also rising prices and the risk of cultural commodification. Culturally, Peru is thriving. Its cuisine is now world famous, often hailed as among the best in Latin America, if not the world. Dishes like ceviche, lomo saltado, and ají de gallina are staples, while Lima has earned a reputation as a global food capital, with restaurants like Central and Maido topping international rankings. This culinary boom has given Peruvians a sense of pride and identity on the global stage. But everyday meals remain rooted in tradition, whether it's a simple plate of potatoes with chili sauce in the highlands or roasted guinea pig served at a family gathering. Religion continues to play a central role. Catholicism is dominant, a legacy of Spanish colonization, but evangelical Christianity has been growing rapidly in recent decades. At the same time, indigenous beliefs remain woven into daily life. In many Andean communities, offerings are still made to Pachamama, the Earth Mother, alongside attendance at Catholic Mass. This blending of faiths reflects Peru's complex identity, where different worlds coexist, sometimes uneasily, sometimes seamlessly. Politically, Peru is turbulent. The country has faced chronic instability in recent years, with a dizzying turnover of presidents. Between 2016 and 2023, Peru went through 6 different presidents, a carousel of corruption scandals, impeachments, and protests. In 2022, President Pedro Castillo was ousted after attempting to dissolve Congress, sparking massive demonstrations, particularly in the Andean regions where he had strong support. These protests revealed the deep divide between Lima's political elite and the rural, largely indigenous population, who often feel excluded from national decision-making. Corruption is a major issue. Almost every modern president has been investigated or jailed for corruption-related charges. This has fueled widespread distrust in government and institutions. For many Peruvians, the feeling is that politicians, whether left or right, are more interested in lining their pockets than addressing real problems like poverty, inequality, and infrastructure. Speaking of inequality, it's one of the defining features of modern Peru. Lima is home to gleaming shopping malls, luxury apartments, and high-tech startups. But in the highlands and jungle, poverty rates remain stubbornly high. Rural communities often lack access to basic services like healthcare, clean water, and quality education. Indigenous groups, especially in the Amazon, continue to fight for land rights and protection against deforestation and oil extraction. The gap between urban and rural Peru is not just economic, but cultural, shaping how different regions see themselves and the state. Education has expanded, with more Peruvians attending universities than ever before, but quality varies dramatically. Urban schools have better facilities and resources, while rural schools may lack even basic materials. Universities in Lima produce skilled graduates, but many leave the country for better opportunities abroad. Brain drain is a problem, as ambitious young Peruvians often feel they can't achieve their dreams at home. On the global stage, Peru plays an interesting role. It's part of trade agreements like the Pacific Alliance and exports to markets across Asia, Europe, and the US. It hosted the UN climate talks COP20 in Lima, positioning itself as a voice for environmental concerns, though its own record on deforestation and mining conflicts is mixed at best. Peru also has a sizable diaspora with large communities in the US, Spain, and Italy. Remittances sent back home play a vital role for many families. Sports provide another unifying force. Football, soccer, is king, and the national team's qualification for the 2018 World Cup after a 36-year absence was a moment of collective joy. Players like Paulo Guerrero and Jefferson Farfan became household names, and the red and white jersey remains a source of national pride. Volleyball is also popular, especially among women, while surfing has a dedicated following along Peru's Pacific coast. Daily life in Peru reflects both the challenges and the richness of the country. In Lima, commuters face hours-long traffic jams while street vendors weave between cars selling snacks. In Cusco, tourists snap photos in the Plaza de Armas, while locals gather for festivals that mix Catholic saints with Inca traditions. In the jungle, riverboats carry families between remote communities, far from the noise of the capital. Despite hardship, Peruvians are known for their warmth, resilience, and humor, traits that help them navigate political crises, economic uncertainty, and everyday struggles. Modern Peru is a country where ancient traditions meet global trends, where breathtaking natural beauty sits beside environmental degradation, where economic growth exists alongside deep inequality. It's a place of resilience, contradictions, and constant change. To understand Peru today is to understand a nation that has survived conquest, colonialism, and corruption, and still finds ways to reinvent itself.